Cell 411 is a great free app for Android and iPhone. It allows you to set up public and private cells for dealing with crime, emergencies, setting up neighborhood watch, activism, and even protecting your kids from bullies on the street or at school. Cell 411 gives your cells turn-by-turn directions to your location with one touch on your phone. There is also a Bluetooth panic button available that can be worn on your wrist, belt, or around your neck. Cell 411 has real-time chat for each alert so you can discuss the incident with family or friends in real-time video streaming. The video is stored on Cell 411's servers so your evidence cannot be deleted if your phone is taken or destroyed. Cell 411 has decentralized ride-sharing that allows for payment in any form: crypto, barter, silver, cash, etc. Cell 411 does not take a cut of your fare. Get Cell 411 free on Google Play and the iTunes Store, or go to getcell411.com. That's getcell411.com.
Dead blood in the streets, it's up to my ankles. Feet flat in the streets, it's up to my knees. Feet flat in the street, the town of Chicago. Feet flat on the rise, it's following me.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Abolitionist Abstractions. As always, we are covered by a BIPCOT no government license. This allows reuse by anyone except government and the agents thereof. You can find out more information about this at bipcot.org. So I am back, and I have another guest this week. I am very pleased to be joined by Mary J. Ruwart, PhD, who many people may know, I think, Healing Our World, her first book. That was your first book, right?
Yes.
Yes, I think was how a lot of people know. But Mary has been in the libertarian and liberty circles for quite a while now, and I'm very pleased to talk to her. So, Mary, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, like I said, it's definitely my pleasure. I've known about you for quite a while. I've seen your names come up. I've seen talks you've given and stuff like that. And I always kept saying, once I started doing podcasts, I kept saying, that's somebody I would like to talk to one day. And then I just kept forgetting about it. And I happened to be having a conversation with my friend Danilo Cuellar, who I know you've spoken to, I think recently. I know he put a podcast out with you guys, although with him I never know because sometimes he records them and doesn't put them out for a year. But I think it was recently because he was mentioning your new book that's about to come out soon, and I was like, "That's it. I have to talk to her. We got to get this done." So I'm very glad you had time to talk to me today. You're like I said, most people I think may know you from your first book, but you have a new one coming out. I think it's coming out in less than 2 weeks now, right?
Yes, it's Death by Regulation: How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim It.
Yeah, now that when I heard you mention, I heard Danilo talk about it with you on the show a little bit, and I was very intrigued by it, obviously, because the title alone, catches my attention because I'm a big proponent of taking away as many possible regulations from the government as we can. So would you want to? I'm sure you've done some interviews and stuff on this, book circuit type things, but would you mind telling us a little bit about what you got going on in the book that's coming out?
Sure. Well, one of the exciting things for liberty-minded people is that sometimes, we have a hard time talking about the bad parts of regulation because the studies haven't been that elaborate. But in the case of the pharmaceutical industry and the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act, we actually have a lot of information. So what I did is pulled this all together and showed that about half the people who have died since 1962 from disease have lost about 10 years of their lives to these FDA regulations. And another way of looking at it is that all of us have lost about 5 years of our lives to it, if it's spread out evenly, so to speak. And so from a libertarian standpoint or a liberty-minded standpoint, the book actually is probably the best demonstration of how deadly regulations can be. So that's one point. The other point is in doing this work, of course, and in being engaged in the pharmaceutical industry for 19 years, what I realized is that these amendments to the Food and Drug Act in 1962 empowered the FDA in a way that allows the FDA to add more and more and more regulations every year. And so it has reshaped the pharmaceutical industry into this big pharma conglomerate with all the attendant problems, high drug prices, which are directly related to the cost of of all these regulations that new drugs must go through. And it actually censors information, life-saving information, about nutritional and preventative type of approaches, and even censors information about new uses for old drugs. And in the case of aspirin, for example, there was about a 20-year cap on sharing the information about how helpful aspirin could be in heart attacks. And since cardiovascular disease is our number one killer, that censorship cost a lot of lives. I estimate about 1.7 million lives in my book. So this is the type of thing that the book talks about. And I want to emphasize for your listeners that even though I was in research in the pharmaceutical industry, I was very interested in nutrition and prevention, because one of the ways in which we made our rats sick back in the olden days when I was working there was to take away their vitamins or overwhelm their systems with too much carbohydrates or too much fat, because we didn't have the genetic tools that we have today. So all of the researchers realized that optimal nutrition is very, very important. And so this is why prevention is so important and knowledge about this nutrition is so important. But that's one of the things that was censored with these 1962 amendments. And that probably was more deadly than any impact on the pharmaceutical industry. However, it's hard to estimate exactly how bad it was simply because the studies haven't been done there. But they have been done in the pharmaceutical industry. So the numbers I quoted a little earlier are just related to the pharmaceutical industry. We haven't even gone to the place where we can calculate how much the censorship of prevention really has cost us.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I obviously have a bias towards believing the FDA is up to, well, no good as far as the individual is concerned. That's my general bias, of course, being an anarchist. But I started reading up on, some of the things I've seen, different things you've written up about the book that was coming out and some of the other times that you've written about this topic. And number one, of course, like most people, I'm sure, I had no idea about those amendments themselves, the original amendments themselves. And the censoring of things, I kind of knew about that to a certain extent, because of course, if you're talking about the pharmaceutical industry and you're talking about the FDA and you're talking about nutrition, I mean, the food pyramid that was forced on people for so long and has been just proven to be horribly wrong over and over and over again. But that's the type of thing that they've been pushing. So I always had this idea that they did that, but I never took into consideration how many people this would actually affect, because usually most people don't think about it beyond their own scope. It's oh well, if I had known about this, I might have been able to prevent this. But yeah, so many people, it's scary. I mean, from time to time I put my little tinfoil hat on, but it's just it almost seems like this is all by design to kind of make not kill people off, but just make sure that nobody has access to other options. And I personally have to deal with that within my own family, because I have a daughter who was born with cerebral palsy, and she's also seizure prone, and trying to get medications for her. Well, actually trying to get treatment for her, I should say, without automatically going to the very high-priced pharmaceuticals that all the doctors want to push on them is extremely difficult. And I actually live in a state which, most people will laugh because it's New York. So most people think of New York, I think it's horrible as far as government goes. And it is largely. But they actually did finally, quote unquote, allow, medical cannabis, which meant things like CBD oil and stuff like that shouldn't be a problem. But they still give us difficulties, like the hoops they make people jump through in order to get other treatments that have shown to be effective, not by the FDA, not by the CDC, not like by any of the government organizations that are supposed to take care of all these things, but there's tons and tons of independent research and anecdotal evidence out there to show that, like I said, in this particular instance, I'm focused on the CBD because that's what I have to deal with. But I know there's so many other medications like this too, and treatments that are just not allowed because the hurdles they put in front of people. And it drives me batty because it's always couched in the name of what I refer to as safetiness. I know that's not really a word. It's a word I like to use in reference to the government, but like it's always couched in terms of our safetiness, but it actually makes us the least safe.
Exactly. Well, aggression always backfires. That's been my experience, and my research has really kind of confirmed that. So I really understand where you're coming from. And again, this is life-saving information we're talking about, and life-saving drugs on occasion. So what I'm doing to get the word out, so to speak, is I'm allowing people who will pre-order the book before its release on April 10th to get $60 worth of free stuff from myself and my partners, so that they're encouraged to order the book through me at deathbyregulation.us. That's deathbyregulation.us, and then on April 10th, we'll be putting all the orders into Amazon at once to hopefully shoot it up to the Amazon bestseller list. If we do that, Amazon will start promoting the book too. And I think this is a great opportunity for liberty lovers because, again, it's probably the best demonstration of how deadly regulations can actually be. It shows bad law is just as life-threatening as bad drugs. So I think it's really going to be an important thing. And you were talking about the suppression of information about CBD oil and things like this, and that actually, of course, happens. Another thing that happens that most people don't realize is that the regulations have added about a decade to the time it takes from a new drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. And when the AIDS patients were, suffering and needed drugs, what they did is, of course, they realized they couldn't wait 10 years. So they hired black market chemists to make the same drugs we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry. And by the time the FDA finally gave us permission to put them in people, all the AIDS patients already had the drug and was resistant to it, all the ones in the US, because they had distributed it throughout the AIDS community. And so we had to wait for new patients to be diagnosed. And of course, the FDA prosecuted and persecuted many of these people, as your listeners probably know through watching the award-winning movie Dallas Buyers Club. If the activists weren't well connected with the media, the FDA went after them. And it's really sad because most of the things the buyers clubs were selling, which include nutritionals, drugs from overseas, and of course the very drugs we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry, when that package was used by a lot of the AIDS patients, many of them added years to their lives far beyond what the doctors had predicted. So this is really, truly a matter of life and death.
Yeah, it really is, and you mentioned the Dallas Buyers Club. That's the first thing I was thinking as soon as you said that. I'm like, isn't that the story of that movie? And yeah, it was. So hopefully, I mean, I'm going to put a lot of this stuff in the show notes too. But hopefully, if people haven't seen that yet, you can get that. Was a good movie, but it did show the inner workings, and it's really, like you said, it's a lot of people, and myself included, unfortunately, like I said, kind of shrug some of this stuff off as just like, oh, this is government, of course it's bad. But when you really dig into the details about this, like I said, I always have my guard up when it comes to these type of things because I expect bad. I expect the badness to come from government. I expect from the coercive system. I expect bad things to happen. But like when I was reading into this, the stuff that you've gone into with the with the numbers and stuff, again with the pharmaceutical industry, it's kind of always assumed. I know people, people that I know and we talk about that they do things to prolong this stuff. But like when I heard from you that it was like literally an actual decade, like that's insane.
Yes, yes, it is.
Even back when this all started, in with the amendments back in the early '60s, even with the technology then, making people wait 10 years for this type of stuff was insane. Now, in this day and age, with the technology that we have, that things can be produced and tested so much quicker, to keep it at that, to keep it at a decade is like beyond insane. Like I don't even know I'm thinking like Spaceballs right now, like ludicrous speed at this point, because it's like, what else is there to describe that? It's just, it really is, and that's why not like when you hear this type of stuff, when you hear these specifics, these details, how like insidious this really sounds. Now it makes sense to me why there's so many people that are, just like in any group where you have the people that are the anti-pharmaceutical companies, just like you have in any group with an anti-this, there's always the extremists that just see everything as a conspiracy and they write everything off, throw the baby out with the bathwater, everything's wrong. And they tend to, unfortunately, taint the idea of looking into this stuff for a lot of people, because they're just like, oh, those people are crazy. But when you actually look into this research, it's like, no. They do have a point on a lot of this stuff. It really has been just, it's beyond just like, government's hands and things and manipulating things here. No, they're really trying to control how people live and how people die. And that's why no matter how many times, during, as much as I don't really pay attention to politics anymore, I remember the whole thing when McCain was running and he had Palin and his running mate, and they kept going at Obama. And then afterwards with the Obamacare thing, they kept going at him with the death panels, and everybody kept saying, no, she's crazy. There's no such thing. It's like, no, actually, if you look into this type of research, that's exactly what it is. The people who run the government are literally deciding who gets to live and who gets to die. They're playing God.
Well, and they don't even realize they're doing it sometimes. I've talked to some of the FDA people about the research I've been doing here, and some of them get it. But, they are under pressure too, because what happens is if there's a side effect that becomes well known by the American public, Congress beats up on the FDA and blames them. And that's why takes so long to get a drug out, because the FDA is trying to defend itself and wants to be able to point to all these years of studies and say, hey, we made them do all these years of studies. Of course, no system's perfect. And, prior to the amendment passage, less than 3% of drugs actually were withdrawn once they were approved, which meant that, it was about 2.5% or so of drugs, just you couldn't tell that the side effects were going to happen until it got to the big market. Now, today, after the amendments, that number is actually a little higher. We withdraw about 3.5% of our drugs. So, drugs aren't any safer than they were before the amendments. And that was the whole intention, supposedly, of the amendments, to make sure drugs were safer and more effective. And they aren't more effective either by all the studies that have been done. In fact, in a way, drugs are more dangerous not because they're inherently more dangerous, but because the costs go up every year, the regulatory costs go up every year, and because that's related to what we pay at the pharmacy. There's a direct correlation. There comes a time when the companies say, hey, it's not worth it to develop this drug because there's not enough people that will take it. We can't recover our development costs. And so what's happening is companies are only developing drugs that you're supposed to take for a lifetime. And when you are taking a drug for a lifetime, your body has a hard time handling it. It can take it for, a month or two. But if you're taking a drug for decades, that really depletes your body of nutrients and things that are required by the body to detoxify these drugs. And then if you start adding more and more drugs to your regimen. So, we have some seniors taking a couple dozen drugs a day. They interact. And so you're really kind of playing Russian roulette here when you start taking that many drugs, because they interact. You're taking them for a lifetime. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation. And if we didn't have the amendments, we would still be having the development of drugs, even without patents, for example. I remember in the mid-'70s when I joined the Upjohn Company, we were still developing drugs without patents. But a few years after I joined, management said, no, don't even propose trying to develop a drug without a patent, because we can't recover our development costs. And another little story your listeners might enjoy is, or not enjoy, I mean, they'll be horrified by it, but I mean, enjoy in the sense of learning, is that a lot of the innovation, both in the drug industry and in the nutritional supplement industry, have been thwarted by these amendments. I actually got a call from the FDA one day, and they had heard that I had filed a patent for prostaglandins in liver disease. Prostaglandins are a natural hormone that your body makes. Every cell in your body makes it, and it's why you take fish oil, because you want to make sure your body has the building blocks for these very good prostaglandins, which can help your body heal. And so the FDA called me up, and they were very excited about this patent. They wanted to assure us that they were going to help us get this drug to market. But, you know, when you have something that's truly new, you don't know what dose to give. You don't know how many times a day you have to dose. You don't know things like how many years you have to treat patients, and even what effectiveness type of parameters that the FDA will accept. And if you do your studies, which take years, your human studies, and you guess wrong on any of these things, then you won't have the statistical significance that the FDA requires, and you have to start all over again. And what the Upjohn Company figured out with the patent on the prostaglandin that they wanted to use was that by the time, if we had to repeat the studies, if we didn't guess right the first time, by the time the drug got to market, it would go generic the first day. We'd never recover our development costs. So they decided not to do it. And, you know, subsequent studies here and there have shown that probably would have been quite effective, but it probably won't ever go on the market just because of the problems that you have in developing something truly new.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it's of course beyond unfortunate. And you know, as you were telling that story, I was thinking, I know a lot of people's reaction, at least you know my experience, when you hear like that part of the story that Upjohn was just like, oh, we're not even going to bother, and the reason why. A lot of people's mind goes, oh, look, it's like the stereotypical greedy capitalist or whatever. It's like, oh, they're not going to make money, or they're going to lose money, so they don't want to help people. But as you're explaining, most people also don't realize how much is involved in this, and how, like you said, the pressure that everybody's under, you know, even the people at the FDA, and that may be hard for some of my listeners to hear, some of my more ardent anarchists who are just like anti-government about everything. I get that, and I used to be like that about people, and I've tried to soften my stance a lot, because hearing these stories, you realize, I mean, like you said, the people from the FDA went to you directly. They did. It wasn't like you had to go ask them for anything. They were overly excited. So, you know, that right there is an example of people who you could clearly see actually wanted to help people, because they were trying to get this thing out there so people could be helped.
Well, that's right. That's right. It's not that they're bad people, but the incentives are wrong. You know, in other words, if before the amendments, the drug companies would send their data to the FDA. And if the FDA didn't object in a certain amount of time, they could market their product. But today, because of the amendments, somebody has to sign on the dotted line at the FDA. So they're putting their neck in the noose. And if the drug has a side effect that comes to the attention of the American public, and the American public gets outraged, then Congress beats up on the FDA. And so, you know, if you think about it, these FDA examiners are afraid, you know, it could cost them their job to prove a drug, but every drug has side effects. There's no drug that is free of side effects. So consequently, if FDA was only going to approve drugs that were totally safe and totally effective, there wouldn't be any approvals at all. That's just the way it is. But a lot of people want to guarantee that when they take a drug, it's going to be safe and effective. And there's just no such thing. And I think that's one of the expectations that Congress has on the FDA. And actually, if you look on their website, the FDA's website, you see several pages where it talks about how they make sure drugs are safe and effective. So the expectation of the American public is way out of line with the reality of what drugs can and cannot do.
Well, sure. And I at least I think that comes back to, that term I used earlier, safetiness. It's that whole idea that's been pumped into people's heads for so long, including the people who are currently in Congress. And on some level, a lot of these people, like, they believe that. It's just like, well, this is what we've been taught. This is what we've been conditioned to believe, basically. That these particular organizations are here for our benefit. They're here to make us safe. So if this is the process we have to go through, then we have to. And there, of course, there's going to be people that whether inside the government itself, inside the Congress, whatever, or even in the pharmaceutical industry that do have bad intentions, but that's not the overall majority of people. Most people just end up, like you said, kind of like going along with it because they're put in this position now. Because just like, a phrase I like to use is, the road to hell is paved with government intentions, because it always starts out that way. It's always started off with a good idea, usually, of we want to make people safe, or, we want to make sure this happens, or we want to make sure this doesn't happen, but it gets manipulated over time. And, that's why I don't subscribe to a lot of the theories that all of this is done by design. I think a lot of it is just happenstance that it ends up working out, and then people later on are like, oh, this is how we could take advantage of it. Because when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, unfortunately, on top of having to deal with the FDA and the regulations and stuff like that, there are the barriers to entry that have been, the other regulations that have been put in that keep certain companies at the top. And while they do have to deal with stuff with the FDA and the government, they do still have a huge benefit over anybody else who would want to try to put these things out to market, because they're actually already there. The big companies like the Pfizers and the Mercks and stuff like that, they've been put in a position now. And I don't think it was, I don't think they were these evil people at the beginning and they were like, oh, we're going to get in crony with government so we can kill everybody. But now they're in that position, and it's like, okay, well, this is what we do. But I mean, sad doesn't even cover it, but it just, like, that's just the feeling I have when I hear these things, because you just think about how many people who could have had happier, healthier, longer lives if it wasn't for government getting in the way of itself, as is often the case. You said it earlier, the aggression always backfires. The coercion, it always ends up backfiring. And this is one thing that is well documented. You don't even have to go deep down in research and stuff like you've done with like a particular industry. You just go down the take a brief stroll down the history of different governments, and you see this happen over and over and over again. And people just don't learn.
Well, yeah, and it's hard, and it's hard to understand the pharmaceutical industry because unless you're an insider like I was, you really don't see what's happening. I mean, one of the things in my lab is we used to joke as the years went by that we had spent so much time meeting the regulations that we didn't have time to discover new drugs. And I mean, that was sort of gallows humor because, obviously we knew that was really destroying our ability to save lives, but there wasn't much we could do about it. And that's why I spent so much time putting this book together, because frankly, because I'm a libertarian and because I've had this research experience in the pharmaceutical industry, and because I've consulted since then for a lot of the nutraceutical companies or the nutrition companies and supplement industry, and even been an expert witness against the FDA.
Oh, wow.
I really have, yes, I have a background it's sort of unique. So I'm able to pull this material together and explain it to people in a way that very few people would be able to. And that's why I've put the time in on this book, because I didn't feel there were many people who could have written this book. And so I want to pass that on to your listeners as well. And again, remind them, if they if they're able to order before April 9th, they will get about $60 in free gifts. And I want them to be able to take advantage of that. So I'm going to mention the URL one more time, deathbyregulation.us. That's deathbyregulation.us. And of course, anyone who wants to learn more about me or read a couple of my blogs on this book can go to my website, which is ruwart.com, ruwart.com.
Yes, excellent. And of course, I will, again, I'll definitely put those all in the show notes and stuff. And yeah, I would highly encourage other people to, I mean, if you don't get a chance to take advantage of the deal, definitely get the book either way. And not just to support Mary, but yeah, because I think as I was listening to you, I was like, my first instinct was like, well, if I said something like that, people would think I was just being cocky, but about not thinking too many other people could write this type of book. But I think you're right, because you do have I think, at least what I know of you, like I said, I've watched a lot of your talks over the years, and I've read a lot of your stuff and listen to your interviews, and I think you do obviously have a very unique position because the experience you have from being on the inside, which of course is, again, this is kind of provable throughout history. You just look at all the people who came out from the inside and of different areas like this and actually presented their information. It's like, yeah, it's very valuable, because you don't know. People on the outside usually assume one way or the other, depending on where their biases lie. They get their information from whatever news source they get, and they're just like, oh well, like I said, some people will think, oh, they're all horrible. They're greedy people that are trying to kill people, and on the other hand, they're the other extremists that think they're basically sent from heaven. These amazing people that all they want to do is help people. You people are all crazy. But then there's people in the middle that go, wait a minute, there's got to be more to this story. So having an insider's perspective, obviously huge. And then for you especially, because you've been in the libertarian circles for a very long time. And I've only been here for a few years now, so anybody past 10 years has been in it for a very long time to me. But you've also, I know you like to, because the title, the subtitle of your first book was the Compassion of Libertarianism, right? Healing Our World. Yeah, and I know, listening to your recent interview that you did with my friend Danilo, you guys talked about this a little bit too, about the way you present your message, because you're not just coming at it from a libertarian perspective, which unfortunately, a lot of people outside the libertarian circles have this very rigid stereotype of what they believe libertarians to be, and actually a lot of it's not too far off. And this is actually something I did kind of want to get into with you maybe in a little bit, but the fact that you're a woman in the libertarian circles, which the stereotype is it's a bunch of white guys in their mom's basement, or just guys who want to smoke weed or whatever. And unfortunately, if you look at the demographics, yeah, it's a lot. It's definitely shifted a lot in that direction. So the stereotype's not exactly wrong, but because you have the message of libertarianism and you come at it from a female perspective, which is, in my opinion, still it's getting better, I think, but it's still sorely lacking. And you don't take the very rigid, logical, in your face, almost what I refer to as Asperger-tarianism, because I am somebody who I have Asperger's, and I know a lot of people in the community are pretty close, if not actually on the autism spectrum somewhere. Another stereotype that tends to be proven out because it's the whole logical thing. But the approach of just kind of like, well, these are the facts and I don't understand why you're not getting them. You take a much more compassionate approach with that, which I know I used to mock that type of approach, but I have seriously pulled myself back on that and realized that no, some of my friends that were doing this years ago, they had a point. You can't just bash people over the head with this stuff. So when you have a much softer approach, more people are willing to listen.
Well, not only that, if you think about it, the beauty in my mind of libertarianism is that it's not just moral and ethical, it's practical. It's two sides of the same coin. And once you've recognized that, then you can address people where they come from. For example, if they just want to see, universal peace and plenty, for example, which many of us do, then it's easy to show how the libertarian principles bring us to that. And that's, I think, something that people need to hear, because obviously if our philosophy is just based on moral grounds and doesn't work in the real world, it's not going to fly. So it's got to be moral and practical, not just moral. And I think that's something that the movement has finally recognized. And I remember in the early days of Healing Our World, I got a lot of criticism for talking about the practical aspects of liberty, because it was felt that if you didn't emphasize the moral, then when something became practical, aggression became practical, people would go for that. But aggression isn't practical. That's the whole bottom line. It backfires every time. I haven't found one instance where it does not. And there are, of course, we could get into just a whole hour on libertarian philosophy and where I think, maybe we could have done a better job, but that's something else. But I do want to get back to something you said, which I thought was really important. And, talking about the idea that the reason the drug prices are high is because, of greed. Well, all companies are greedy for profit. All of them have to answer to their stockholders. So why would, if you think about it for a moment, why would the pharmaceutical industry in particular, be greedy and other companies wouldn't? Well, what happens is these regulations actually encourage greed, in my opinion. What happens is for example, there's been some instances of generic drugs which have gone to really high prices. And I'd like to talk about that for a moment, because these regulations make that possible. It wouldn't have happened back before 1962. So what happens is when a drug company invents a new drug and then it goes generic, they usually continue making it and may even supply the genetic marketers of the drug, or they may market their own generic version. But after a while, as the drug becomes older, of course, it's replaced by better drugs. So the generic companies quit making it. And one of the reasons they quit making it is that the FDA about 10 years ago got very tough on generic companies and started really inspecting them and giving them a hard time. And many of them just said, hey, we're not going to make these drugs anymore. And the company, so what happens is sometimes there was only one company left standing that's making a generic drug, especially if it doesn't sell very much. And they generally keep the price low because, they're interested in new drugs. They're not interested in these older drugs so much. But then there has been a tendency now for companies, small companies, basically investment companies, to go around and look for generic drugs that only have one manufacturer. And then they get the exclusive license for it. So only they can sell it. And they jack the price up. And this would not be happening if the FDA was not driving some of the generic manufacturers out of business, because, they make it so tough, it's not worth the while the company to pursue it. And so, a lot of the stories you heard in recent times is because, and EpiPen's a good example. EpiPen didn't have competition for a while because even though the FDA had gotten applications from other companies to market a similar product, they didn't let them on the market. So, all of this high pricing comes from a lot of the monopoly practices that the 62 amendments have created. And, only when government gets involved and regulates other companies out of business can this happen. So this is a good lesson for all of us, that it's very important not to let regulators create these monopolies and cartels, because that's what happens.
Well, yeah, and right, what you said there at the end about the monopolies is what I was going to go to next, because that's exactly it. Along with the conditioning for safetyness that everybody believes that government is there for, it's also another misnomer people have, another idea that they have very wrong, I would say, about government, is that they're there to prevent monopolies and stuff like this and cartels from forming. And it's like, well, no. Again, if you just look at the history of most governments, even just the United States government, you see that it actually helps create monopolies and cartels. And yeah, like you said, it does incentivize these people. I mean, wasn't the EpiPen, I remember that, but wasn't he had something, he had the other drug, that Martin Scarlett guy.
Daraprim. Yeah, Daraprim.
Yeah.
It was a that was a typical example of how these little companies, these little investment companies are working. They get the exclusive license, jack the price up, and there's nothing anyone can do about it because no one's going to start manufacturing that, with the restrictions that they have to go through, and it's really a sad story. So greed is actually encouraged, if you will, by the amendments. The other thing I wanted to point out is a lot of people say, well, the the increasing regulatory costs don't really count, but they do. If you plot the research and development costs that a company has versus the price that we pay at the pharmacy for new drugs, there's a direct correlation. And that's true for advertising and manufacturing too. One of the things these amendments did is they made it very difficult for companies to manufacture because FDA put down all these new regulatory standards for manufacturing. And of course, the small companies had more trouble meeting them than the large companies just because the manufacturing facilities were so much larger in the big companies. And so it drove a lot of the small manufacturers out of business. And it's an incredible cost that was levied on the manufacturing aspect of drugs, as well as advertising. Most people don't realize that the government has to approve virtually every advertisement that the companies put out. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes on to get these ads acceptable to the FDA. So advertising costs are high in the pharmaceutical industry, but part of that is the regulatory cost. So there's a lot of things that were affected by these amendments that have increased the cost of drugs that are really hidden from the public. They don't understand this because medical devices, medical drugs, hospitals, medical practitioners, all the regulations involving things that have to do with medicine make it probably the most regulated industry in the country. And that means that those regulatory costs, most of which do nothing to protect us, get passed on to us as consumers and really make it tough to pay the medical costs that we have today.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember years ago going through things with my grandmother when she was having problems getting different drugs because she was on a fixed income and it was so like you were talking about earlier with some of the generic ones that end up being priced higher because a lot of the times these companies are able to take advantage of these situations. I remember her running into stuff like that, and it's just the whole. Like I said before, what starts as the plan to make people safe always ends up being worse because it does. Regulations, when they're first put in place, necessarily create barriers to entry for new companies to try to come into the market. And then the more regulations that are piled on, like you were describing, start pushing companies that were already established, start pushing them out because it's just not worth it. And, the average person who doesn't really understand the coercive nature of government, or even without that, a lot of times it's people who just don't understand basic economics, unfortunately, is that, they just look at it as these greedy companies. And I've always tried, for a long time, I tried to explain things to people from like the small business perspective, because I ran my own, I had a pet sitting business that I ran for 12 years. And I tried to make people understand, like, I am shrinking down what you're talking about, these evil corporations. Like, look at my company. Like, I'm a smaller version of that. And I have to deal with the same type of BS. I actually ended up lucky that there wasn't as many restrictions here in New York as I thought there would be, because because of the fact that government's so large in every other area. But there was still plenty of things that I had to deal with. And I ran into plenty of other people over the years who either thought about starting a similar type of company, but didn't want to deal with the extra BS that they'd have to go through, or other people that were constantly trying to skirt all of that stuff because they didn't want to or couldn't afford to pay for, to pay to get over the barriers in the first place, just to get started to try to provide a service for other people, which again, it's another thing a lot of people who don't really understand, and again, I don't mean to like pick on people, but it usually is the people who've never actually tried to run their own business. They really have a hard time understanding this. Like from the outside, you could look at it as greed. It's like, but you have no idea what that business owner, and even if you're talking about a big corporation, even if you're talking about a big pharmaceutical company, you really have, unless you've been on the inside or unless you've really researched this stuff, you have no idea what goes into that company and what they have to, even besides the government regulations. Like that's just the icing on the cake they have to deal with on top of everything else. Like everything else, from paying people to making sure their employees are secure and safe and all this stuff, and dealing with other government regulations in other forms just to run their business. And then you get if you have to deal with the FDA or any other alphabet soup agency, that just adds so many more things. And it adds time, and time is money. And that's just a reality that a lot of people, I don't think, either want to grasp or can't grasp. And that's why they just automatically go, oh, well, the pharmaceutical companies are greedy. That must be what it is.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, these 62 amendments are really a matter of life and death for all of us, whether we're regulators, whether we're pharmaceutical executives, whether we're patients, doctors, whatever. We're all affected by this, because when we lose 50 to 80% of our innovation, both in drugs and in prevention, which we have due to these amendments, then what that means is that all of us pay years of our lives for these amendments. And while that's very tragic, in another sense, it's good news for change, because if we're all affected negatively and lose years of our lives, then even if we thought we would gain by having a monopoly, for example, we realize that by having a system like this, we actually are hurting ourselves ultimately, and we will lose years of our lives and watch our loved ones do that too. So I think one of the positive aspects for change that I see is that we are all affected. And because we're all affected, hopefully we can get some agreement that we shouldn't have these bad laws that have side effects just as deadly as bad drugs.
Yeah. I hope you're right, because that is usually what it takes. I found, at least for most people, to really start to wake, I hate to use the term wake up, but I just went to go use it anyway, but and kind of realize what's going on and how they're being negatively affected by things like this, because it usually takes it for them to actually happen to them or somebody very close to them. They have to go through that process, because they can, plenty of people, and I know I was like this for years, you could read stories, you could watch videos about this stuff, you could hear about these things, and they all, they may seem bad, and it may be, oh yeah, there's definitely something up there, I should probably look into this. But then you forget about it. Life goes on, life gets in the way, and you move on and you don't really focus on it. But then it's once it actually happens to you, exactly. Once you actually, in this instance, once you get sick and have to go and get these drugs and find out how difficult it is and how expensive they could be, or a loved one, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute. Now, hopefully at that point, you're willing to go, more people than not would be willing to ask why, rather than just assume what the reason for that is. But yeah, that's why I think your book is going to be so important, because hopefully more people coming to these realizations will be able to find it and go, oh, okay, this is not just some conspiracy theory about the government, about the pharmaceutical companies trying to kill us or whatever, whatever. It's just like, here's actual research. This is what's actually happened. This is what's actually been put in place, and this is what's happened. And these are the statistics because of it, and then draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, and you mentioned, of course, when it happens to us, then we're more, we see it better. And, one of the stories I tell in the book is about one of the FDA examiners from the cancer area who kept asking for more and more and more studies when a cancer drug was coming to his desk for approval. And then his wife got cancer. And he found out it was very difficult to get her experimental treatments, mostly because of these amendments. And of course, after she died, he did things differently and was able to cut a month off the approval time in his section, which is a good thing. But, it took that. And the problem is that even those in the FDA who really want to speed the approval process because they understand that withholding an approval can cost many, many lives, even people like that are motivated really can't change the system. The system's kind of taken over. So really what's needed is the system to change. And that's another thing I try to deal with in my book. What is it going to take? And, just repealing the amendments is not enough, because the FDA took a lot of the issues that were causing problems to court, and they got the courts to agree with them. So now it's not just the amendments in Congress that need to be repealed, but these court cases, these precedents, if you will, need to be changed too. And the only really efficient way to do that, in my opinion, is to make it so that the FDA is a certifier rather than a regulator. And the difference is that the FDA could certify and give a seal of approval to drugs, but even if there were drugs out there that didn't have that seal of approval, people could buy them if they felt that it was worth the risk. And there would be other certifiers as well. And actually, there are those organizations today that don't necessarily go through a certification process, but actually have a pretty good handle on what works. For example, the Abigail Alliance has recommended that the FDA approve certain cancer drugs, 40 of them actually, 40 cancer drugs, years before the FDA actually gave the approval. And so obviously, if a consumer group can tell you which drugs are effective years before the FDA gives the approval, it's obviously possible for people to and other organizations to evaluate and certify drugs. And then Public Citizen, who does a lot of things I don't like, but they did something very good. They have a list called Best Pills, Worst Pills, and they actually predicted correctly that about half of the number of drugs that would be withdrawn from the market because of side effects years before the FDA took them off. So again, we have consumer groups that can do a pretty good job evaluating what's going on. So if consumer groups can do this, certainly a company that took on the task of certifying drugs from a scientific basis could probably do a good job too. So that's a really a better solution in my mind, because then people can wait as long as they want to take a new drug. And there's always a risk with a new drug, because usually all the side effects are not known. So we should be careful. But if you're in a desperate situation, you're terminally ill, you don't have any other options, then that would be the time to take something perhaps that wasn't fully tested. Again, it would be up to the individual, and it should be, because they're the ones that suffer the consequences. I'm always very frustrated when I hear regulators or people who are very conservative say, oh, no, we need to protect people from there might be safety problems. We can't let terminally ill patients take a new drug that hasn't been fully tested. And like the cartoon that I have in Healing Our World, where the guy's in the wheelchair and the FDA is saying to him, hey, these drugs won't be approved in time to help you, but at least you'll die safe. I mean, that's nuts.
Oh, completely insane. And that's why, we've been saying this whole time about how the regulations just get in the way of everything. And that's why, and I think I might have heard you mention this on Danilo's show, but if not, I've heard it elsewhere, and it makes sense. It's like now, because of stuff like this, because of these, the regulations that end up causing all these, these aftershocks years later, and just continue to pile on and add all these other problems. Now the system. I agree with you. I don't think the system, whether it's this part of the system or any part of the system, can actually be changed from within because of how monolithic it is at this point. But they actually, the only thing that could be even attempted is to try to work backwards, which is why some states have those, are try, either have passed or are attempting to pass those, right to try laws type of things, where it's like, we're not going to legalize this stuff, but yeah, if you could prove to us that you're dying, then we'll let you have it. Which to me is still a slap in the face, but I know it's an improvement over what it is in a lot of these states, unfortunately, where it would be illegal for you to take a certain substance if you've already been declared terminal, which, like I said, it's just so insane that they still make you go through that process. It might be a little better, but that's exactly what happens because of all this stuff. They can only try to work backwards, and it still doesn't work. And that's why, I'm with you. I think that other organizations can obviously do this type of stuff. I'm a huge proponent of the idea of basically, moving forward. One of the quickest ways to move towards a voluntary society is to focus more on an honest reputation economy, not what we have right now. Because right now, a lot of it's based on social capital, which is based on this very distorted view and this very binary dichotomy that people have split between themselves. That they're opposed to entire collectives without getting down to the individual level and trying to reach people. So they're having a more honest one, like how Amazon or Yelp or these services, work, where there's ratings and people, like especially on Amazon, where you at least have to be in order to have your opinion really taken seriously, you have to be at least a verified purchaser. So that's like one step towards that. So these things exist now. So of course they can exist even in the pharmaceutical industry, which people don't, people seem to, I think a lot of the reason that people seem to keep that off the table is because it's connected to the health, to health and healthcare. And that's one of those things that so many people, I believe, have either just come to believe or conditioned in some way to believe that it's impossible for that to be provided by the free market. Like that's a separate thing. You can't do that. That's why so many people are so insistent on pushing for more of a socialized system, like it occurs across a good portion of the world.
Right. And if you don't have this kind of insider perspective that I've been able to gather, then you don't recognize what the real problem is. In other words, these regulations sort of act in the background. They're very hidden. So even if a journalist was really trying to understand exactly what's going on, he or she would have trouble getting to the nitty gritty, because insiders have a lot of incentive not to talk. Because if it gets back to the FDA that they're bad-mouthing the FDA, the examiners can slow things down for them. In fact, when I present this data, and I have it at scientific meetings, I've had so many people come up to me and saying, "Oh, I'm so glad somebody's speaking out because we can't." So it's very important, and I want to get back to this right to try that you mentioned, because of course I think it's a wonderful thing. I've talked to Goldwater about it, but it does have an Achilles heel, and that is that, the right to try drugs still have to be in good standing with the FDA. And my fear is that companies will hesitate to get involved in right to try because they'll feel that the FDA may punish them for doing so. There is another initiative coming down the pike. Heartland is putting out a free-to-choose medicine plan, and they've gotten rid of that Achilles heel. Once a drug enters the free-to-choose medicine track, which it does after some safety testing in people and a small amount of effectiveness testing, then it can stay in that separate track forever. It doesn't have to stay in FDA's good graces. So the nice thing about that is once a drug gets into that free-to-choose medicine track, it doesn't need to worry. A drug company isn't going to need to worry that once it does that the FDA is going to punish it, unless it punishes it for its other drugs. I think there would probably be some companies that are just free to choose medicine companies, and others that would probably not do that just because they have other drugs in the FDA programs. So it would be a better step, I think. But ultimately, unless we get rid of the idea that the FDA has to approve something to be marketed, there will always be, I think, a slowing down of the process as companies tread carefully to make sure they aren't compromising their future by getting involved in these different tracks.
Oh, sure. And, I mean, that again, that's evident if you look at, most aspects of, like, like I said before, the overall healthcare field, there's people, these companies do have to take all this stuff into consideration. All these regulatory, even, like you said, even if they're given this avenue where it's like, oh, well, maybe we'll finally be able to get stuff into here. It's like, well, you still have to follow all these regulatory hurdles, and you do have to worry about this possible backlash, which is a very real reality. I mean, that's, you see that happen all the time in plenty of industries where government's involved. They will punish people for not towing the particular line that they want. And,
well, yes. Actually,
go ahead.
And actually, I just want to say, when they have innovative compounds, that's even more true. I mean, in other words, there's been several companies, and I talk about them in my book, that have come out with novel cancer treatments or something, novel treatments for an orphan disease. And it's interesting because the first company to do that and make the breakthrough, who should be acclaimed by all, are the ones that have so much trouble getting it through the FDA, that it's not unusual for them to go bankrupt in the process. And then another company buys them up and eventually, of course, puts the drug on the market. But it's not only does it slow the process down when we have really new breakthrough drugs, but it sends a signal to the market, which says, hey, it's safer to do Me Too drugs than new drugs, because if you do a new drug, a really novel drug, then, it's going to be harder to get it on the market.
Yeah, exactly. And again, even, like most people look at it from the big bad greedy company side, but if you think about it from the perspective of, as I was trying to point out before, like, somebody like myself, the smaller company who is trying to do this type of thing, and it's just like, well, why would I do it? Because if I do it, and then it, chances are I'm going to fail miserably, most likely end up in bankruptcy, like you were describing, and then somebody else is just going to come in and take that and make a whole bunch of, and probably make more money than I would have, but still, just make all, and then okay, good, the product's out there. I mean, from that aspect, sure, it's still out there, but as you said, it was still delayed. How many lives were affected or lost just in that time alone? Or it just, yeah, the whole thing. The whole thing's just rotten. I mean, like I said, I'm definitely all for encouraging people to try to focus some of their attention on these other avenues that are possible now, because the reality is we do have to deal with the system. So if there's ways you can try to find workarounds right now, I mean, I obviously advocate people going outside the system as much as possible. I'm a big proponent of that, and I do that in my own life too. I don't just talk about it because I also am a huge proponent of leading by example. But anything we could do is definitely can lead to this. And the one example I use as far as consumer companies or private companies being able to do stuff like this on a large scale is, of course, always Underwriters Laboratories, which has existed for decades at this point. how long? And they handle things quite well on their own. Making sure that.
I was going to say they're a certifying agency. Some of your listeners might not know that, but they really certify all of our electrical appliances.
Exactly. Yeah. They've sewn up the technology field, and people don't go to the government to have these regulations passed to go, okay, this is good. No, they check. Oh, if Underwriters Laboratory said it's good, okay, it's good. That's the way. And so that exists right now.
Mm-hmm.
So if that exists right now inside of this system, there's no reason to think that these other things aren't possible. And again, that's why I think, your book is so important, because you have this great perspective that you can bring to it and present this information that a lot of people aren't. And usually when stuff like this does get presented, it's often in a very dry manner that people don't want to read. But because you have this very interesting, you have you have the background, you have the insider information, and you have the ability to present it in the more compassionate way that you normally present things anyway. I think it's huge to have the ability to reach more people. So hopefully more people will be receptive this time around, and we can actually start pushing to do this stuff, because whether you take advantage of these other legal avenues that are starting to open up, or you try to work outside of it, like what was portrayed in the Dallas Buyers Club, which again I'm all for. I'm not encouraging anybody to do that, of course, allegedly. But if you would want to, all these type of things, if you can see that what's possible, if you can actually look at this and go, oh yeah, this could easily be done and cut the cost, which benefits everybody as well, as on top of helping everybody live longer, hopefully, and not losing loved ones earlier than you should because they're waiting on this drug that should have been there already, type of deal. But also everybody could become more monetarily wealthier because they won't be shelling out all this money for all these to jump all over these hurdles, and people will still be able to live happier and longer lives. So I think if you look at it from that perspective, you see what, like I said, you can do it. So why not start pushing towards this? So I don't know.
Well, that's right. That's right. And again, I want to remind your listeners that if they order the book before April 9th, they do get $60 worth of bonuses. One of those bonuses, by the way, is a discount on the Free to Choose Medicine book, which just came out. So I think it's a way that your listeners can not only, of course, get the information in my book, but also get involved in an initiative that is going to be starting up shortly. And of course, I do encourage them to support Right to Try. All of this discussion that goes on about these alternatives helps us move in a more libertarian or liberty-oriented direction. And so the more people hear about it and recognize the problems that people have, the better off we're going to be. Because as I said earlier, we are all affected, whether we're regulators, pharmaceutical executives, patients, just normal, healthy people, doctors, whatever, we're all affected because, of course, first, before we have a profession or anything like that, we are human beings that are affected by these regulations. So I encourage your listeners to go to deathbyregulation.us and check it out.
Yes, and we should, by the time when this does actually come out, well, people that are listening to it, obviously it already came out for you, but it'll be out in time for people to still get a chance to order that. So hopefully you guys do. I'm looking at the time. I'm actually probably going to have to get going pretty soon because I have to get to work soon. But I did want to ask you one more thing that I mentioned earlier. Just because, again, I heard you speak a little bit about this on Danilo's podcast, but I was actually kind of curious to take it a little bit further in a different direction, a slightly different direction. I know you you mentioned, you've talked this, you talk about this openly. Obviously, you've been around in the libertarian scene for decades at this point. And you mentioned on his podcast, and I've heard this from other people who've been around a lot longer than me now too. And it's nice for me to get this more confirmation bias that it's actually true, at least in my opinion, that there's been this, you didn't see any type of surge until the Ron Paul surge, basically from 2007, 2008 on, has been as far as the increase in attention and people coming to this side of the conversation really exploded at that point after not seeing that much of a change for decades, right? That was kind of what you said.
Well, actually, the change was in the youth participation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we did have surges, of course, in the Libertarian Party and in the movement. It's been growing, since its inception. So that's been good. But what we haven't had is for people like myself who've been in a long time, we haven't had the ability to look and see, okay, when it's time for me to pass the baton, who am I going to pass it to? and now I'm delighted to say that Ron Paul, who was kind enough, incidentally, to write the foreword to Death by Regulation, he activated the youth, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. So the next generation, so to speak, well, I don't know how we count the generations, but young people, let's say, are getting very excited about the ideas of liberty, not just here in the U.S., but worldwide. And that's the big surge that we're seeing. And so now there's someone to pass the baton to, which there really hasn't been as much of that until recently. So I'm very excited about that. And it's probably a good thing because that generation is going to have to pay for the sins of the older generations. And by sins, I mean, of course, the national debt, the fact that we've allowed our freedoms to erode here in the U.S., and there's going to have to be some kind of confrontation, hopefully a peaceful one.
Yeah, well, we can only hope. So yeah, it was the youth movement that you were talking about, and I mean, like I said, I've been told that from other people too, and it does, make me feel better. I have a couple of friends that are actually much younger than me at this point who've gotten into it, and I tell them all the time I'm both thrilled that they exist and kind of jealous that they figured things out way before I did, because I was in my mid-30s before I finally started putting all this together. So it's great to see that, but attached to that, the one thing I was curious of, because I did mention, like I said, I mentioned it earlier, and I always find this kind of interesting because it's a stereotype that does seem to fit a lot, that it's a very, the whole libertarian liberty movement is mostly male driven. As someone who's been in it for as long as you have and been able to see these changes and see see these different surges, and especially the youth one lately, do you have an equally positive outlook as far as more females coming to these ideas and accepting these? Because unfortunately, at least from my perspective, and I've seen this up close, where sometimes women that are actually interested or might be interested in these ideas come to different social circles or social media areas where I've been, and they try to ask questions, and then they just get bombarded by the idiocy of the certain population of the libertarian, mostly male community, and they're immediately run off and like, I don't want it. These guys are all crazy, or they immediately go, oh, the stereotypes were true. These guys are all like, they're all sitting in mama's basement with their fedoras and their vapes and all the, whatever the actual caricature is these days. But have you seen, like, has that been something you've seen change as well, or are you hopeful as hopeful as that? Because that I think that's a very important thing, unfortunately, because a lot of people I don't think take that into account, especially the very large wing of the libertarian anarchists groups, like I said, that would qualify as what I would call Aspergitarians. They don't seem to think that matters, and it's like, well, they're half the population, man, or more. We need we need to talk to everybody, don't we?
Right. Well, it's kind of funny because my generation came in with Ayn Rand, and she had this thing about judgment, judge and be prepared to be judged. And I just think that's that's what's happening in our circles. And that's sad because you don't know what the other person's been through or what kind of conditioning or brainwashing they've had. So you need to kind of approach them where they are. And I've had some success in doing this. And you need to create space for people to say, oh, yeah, this idea I've been holding for so long is not so good. And that's kind of a hard thing for people to admit in the first place. So like I said, you have to create the space that they know they'll be accepted and understood, and helped through that phase. And that's something we're not very good at. And I don't know if it's, I think I trace it back to Ayn Rand. And on my website, in my free library, I have a video called "Judgment is Not Libertarian," and that's that's something that I encourage your listeners to check out, because I think we need to come from a much less judgmental place when we're talking to people if we really want to reach them. Like I said, we need to help them through that transition. For many of us, it was an easy transition, especially if we had it when we were young. But I've actually had, after I gave one talk on how liberty enriches the poor, I had someone come to me from the audience, and she said, I'm 65 years old. I've been pushing for all of these liberal reforms, and now I realize I've hurt the very people I've been trying to help. And she was almost in tears. Well, we just kind of spontaneously hugged, and I said, well, yeah, but now, you can, now and you can get the word out. And she was, I mean, that made her feel so good. I mean, she smiled through her tears, and you could just see she was going to go out and do that, and that's how we need to be with people. Beating them up intellectually isn't going to bring them to our side. It's going to scare them away from even considering what we're talking about. So this is something culturally, at least of my generation, women are better at than men just because we were taught to be nurturers and understanding. And I know that some men of my generation didn't get that training, so of course they're they're kind of working against their conditioning there. But I think that's what we need to do. We need to be a little more compassionate about working with people who don't necessarily hold our ideas, but might be open to them if we could create that space for them.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And like I said, I've come around because I used to be one of those very abrasive, very harsh. Just here's the facts. Now do something with them, or go away, or leave me alone. And I've sat back and thought about it. I think it does help that I have to try to soften myself a little bit because I'm now raising 2 girls. So it's like, all right, if I want to, especially like I said, because the stereotype about the mostly male libertarians is kind of true, and that's why I think it definitely helps to have people like you out there to be able to say, hey, look, no, I've been around for a while, and no, it's some of these guys are like that, but not all of them. Although the thing you mentioned about your generation's males and how some of them missed the memo, that hasn't changed much, unfortunately. Maybe in the last couple, but even up until mine, most people still missed that memo. I missed it for a while. So
well, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. I mean, all of us kind of, our culture, I think, breeds us to be judgmental to some extent. So I think that's something we really need to consider carefully. I don't think it serves us. I think it actually backfires. It's sort of the precursor to aggression. If you think about it, if you were going to aggress against somebody, you have to kind of marginalize them in your mind and say, oh, they're so stupid, they don't protect their property, so I'll take it. They don't deserve this, or there's some judgment involved before we become aggressors. So in my mind, if we're true libertarians, what we want to do is avoid that first step. I know libertarians, of course, probably wouldn't act on that, but if you start thinking about people in a judgmental way, it makes it a lot easier to be an aggressor. And I'm not saying your listeners are going to do that if they judge, but judging is the first step down that road, and we really need to consider as libertarians if that serves us.
Hear, hear. Well, like I said, I totally agree with that. And on that note, I think we should get wrapping up because perfect place to end. But first off, thank you very, very much for coming on once again, Mary, and for this conversation. This was great, and I really appreciate you. Not only coming on, but getting this information out there. And I of course, encourage everybody to get this book, get her book, and also take advantage of the offer that Mary has mentioned a couple of times. So before we get going, though, please, anything else you want to say in closing, and of course, give all your plugs, and I will put them all in the show notes so people will be able to find everything.
Well, I want to thank your listeners for their attention, and again, just encourage them to help spread the word of liberty by getting Death by Regulation on the Amazon bestseller list if we can. Pre-order at deathbyregulation.us helps us do that, and of course, to show my appreciation, I've accumulated $60 worth of free gifts for you when you do that, because I want to reward you for your efforts, and I really appreciate your help on that. And of course, go to my website as well, ruwart.com, ruwart.com, and go to my free library. There's lots of good stuff there for you that you don't have to pay anything for, and enjoy.
Yes, I was actually there last night checking things out, and I watched a couple of videos and read some of the stuff. So yeah, definitely go check that out, folks. So once again, thank you, Mary. This has been great. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been Abolitionist Abstractions. All of my content can still be found at solpodcast.org or at Steemit, or not at Steemit, geez, I'm okay. Steemit /at abolitionistj, where all the content goes first. And I'll catch you next time. Love, peace, and voluntary interactions for all.
Indians scattered on Dawn's highway bleeding. Ghosts
This is Daryl W. Perry, host of Free Talk Live. This November, I'll be running in the world's biggest and most popular marathon, the New York City Marathon, and I've accepted a spot on Team Innocence Project because I'm a passionate supporter of their work. Since 1989, 353 people in the United States have been exonerated by DNA testing, including 38 who pled guilty to crimes they did not commit, and 20 of whom served time on death row. The Innocence Project provided direct representation or critical assistance in 180 of these cases. With your help, the Innocence Project can help even more people who have been wrongly convicted. As part of Team Innocence Project, I'm raising awareness about wrongful convictions and raising funds to help free the innocent. I've already paid the race registration fees. However, to secure my spot on Team Innocence Project in the New York City Marathon, I need to raise $3,500 by November 1st. You can support the Innocence Project and help me secure my race entry by going to run.freetalklive.com.